Hey everybody, thanks for joining us in this next installment of the GovCon video blog. So today we're going to discuss requirements in some government contracts that a prime contractor obtain the government's consent before the contractor enters into a subcontract. Now the required consent we're talking about today is written consent by the contracting officer to enter into a particular subcontract. So if it's not written and doesn't identify a particular subcontract, you don't have the required consent. Under the federal acquisition regulations, if a contractor has an approved purchasing system, and that means the purchasing and subcontracting process has passed what's called a contractor purchasing system review by a federal agency. If a contractor has an approved system, the contractor is not required to obtain the government's consent to subcontract except in very limited circumstances. And those circumstances are typically where it's necessary to protect the government's interests, like when a subcontract requires special surveillance because it involves a critical government system. Now, if your company doesn't have an approved purchasing system and two conditions are present, the federal acquisition regulations will require that your company obtain the government's consent before your company enters into a subcontract agreement. The first condition is that the government contract has to be either a cost reimbursement, time and materials, labor hour, or letter contract, or it has to be an unpriced item under a fixed price contract that exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold. The second condition is that the subcontract itself has to be a cost reimbursement, time and materials, or labor hour subcontract, or a fixed price subcontract that exceeds certain minimum thresholds, and those threshold amounts will depend on whether the contracting agency is a civilian agency or if it's a DoD, NASA, or Coast Guard agency. Now, just as an aside, you should know that there are some instances in which a contractor under a cost reimbursement government contract that has an approved purchasing system has to give advance notice of an anticipated subcontract to the contracting officer, but does not have to receive back any written consent. But if your contract and subcontract are of the types that we mentioned before that do require agency consent, here are 4 things your company should know. The first thing that contractors should know is that identifying the subcontractor to the agency is not the same thing as requesting consent. The rules say that just identifying the subcontractor during contract negotiations alone is not enough to satisfy the consent requirement. So the argument that the government must have consented because it knew who the contractor would be is not going to prevail. By the same logic, merely identifying the subcontractor earlier, say in a proposal, and then getting a contract award isn't enough to satisfy the consent requirement. The second thing that contractors should know is that the government's consent to the subcontract isn't a blanket allowance of subcontractor costs. Now, this is again spelled out expressly in the rules. The government, simply by consenting to your choice of subcontractor, isn't taking any position on the terms of the subcontract agreement or whether all of your subcontractor costs are going to be allowed. The third thing you should know is that the consent requirement can be waived if the contracting officer got enough information during contract negotiations. Now, I mentioned earlier that under the rules, you can't assume that you received consent simply because you identified a subcontractor during contract negotiations. You need written consent of your subcontract. And under the rules, the contracting officer has to consider certain data and factors before making its decision to give consent. So your request for consent should address these factors. But the rules also say that if, in the opinion of the contracting officer, the requirements for obtaining consent were met during the officer's evaluation of the subcontract during contract negotiations, then you don't need to obtain formal written consent as long as the contracting officer identifies that subcontract in the government contract. And there's a particular part of the government contract, it's paragraph J of the standard FAR clause, where the contracting officer has to identify the subcontract that it has evaluated and for which consent is no longer required. So if, for example, you're negotiating with the contracting officer and you have a subcontractor that you're ready to sign with and you don't want any delay in the subcontractor's performance, you might also negotiate with the contracting officer to list your subcontract in paragraph J of the standard FAR clause. The fourth thing that contractors should know is that failure to obtain consent may lead to non-recovery of subcontractor costs. Now, the rules say that if a government contract is an hourly rate contract or a time and material contract, and the contractor enters into any subcontract that requires consent without obtaining the consent, the government is not required to reimburse the contractor for any subcontract costs incurred before the date that the government provides its consent. Also, if the government makes progress payments under a contract, it can suspend payments if a contractor is not satisfying a material term of the government contract. So, a contractor that moves ahead with a subcontract without obtaining the required consent risks not getting paid. In addition, the Defense Contract Audit Agency, which audits defense agency contracts, may take the position during a contract audit that costs for a subcontract that a contractor can't prove it obtained consent for should be disallowed. So, going back to the prior point, getting the subcontract listed at the outset in paragraph J of the FAR clause in the contract may eliminate any confusion over whether consent was obtained and which subcontract costs are recoverable. So, to sum up, the four things that contractors should know about the consent to subcontract requirements are: 1. Identifying the subcontractor to the agency during negotiations will not result in any assumption that the agency has given its consent to subcontract. 2. Any consent to a particular subcontract by the government is not a blanket allowance of costs under that subcontract. 3. The consent requirement can be waived by the contracting officer if he or she received all of the information required for consent during negotiations. And 4. A failure to obtain consent may result in a contractor not recovering some or all of its subcontract costs. Well, thanks for joining me in this edition of the GovCon video blog, and I hope you come back for future episodes.